Hello students, this is Mrs. Reitz, and I'm composing this PowerPoint to help you figure out the most effective way to use language and words in your persuasive essay. So one of the things that you want to be concerned with as you're writing is the vocabulary of your issue. Some topics have words that their audience may be unfamiliar with or that are important to define. Even if they are familiar with those terms, you may want to pin them down early on in your essay so everyone knows what you're talking about and there's no ambiguity. So animal testing, there are certain things that come to mind when we hear of animal testing. We might think of mice in a lab or chimpanzees or something like that. So you might want to define what animals are you talking about. Are you talking about, the cute little ones that everyone loves as well as other kinds of animals? Or is there just a specific kind of animal that you're talking about you want to prohibit animal testing on or endorse animal testing on? So, certain animals that are more like humans perhaps are good to test on because they're more like us, but at the same time, maybe that's another reason why it's unethical to test on them. So you might want to define that. You might want to define exactly what animal testing is for the scope of your argument. Are you talking about animal testing for things like makeup, putting mascara on bunny rabbits? Or are you talking about, doing tests on lab rats for cancer? Or are you talking about all of it? That can be okay too, but you want to define the scope of your argument by pinning down any essential terms. Illegal immigration, too, we'll talk about how this term can be very emotionally charged later, but for here you may want to define it, what you mean by it. Are you talking about, again, the thing that comes to a lot of people's minds when they think of illegal immigration is Mexicans crossing the southern border illegally, coming over the wall or something like that. Are you talking mostly about that, or are you talking about all kinds of illegal immigration, like people who have entered the country legally, but they're here now illegally because their visas have expired and they have not left like they were supposed to? We might want to define these terms when we're talking about them. And I shouldn't say we might, we do want to define these terms. And another term like sustainable farming, what do we mean by sustainable farming? Is that code for organic farming? Or does that mean, sustainable means forever and ever? What do you mean when you use these terms? So some terms are very well known by the public and you wouldn't need to define them. I don't know if you need to define space exploration or legalization of marijuana, although that might be something, too, is maybe not pinning down the term, but pinning down exactly the scope of your argument. So I'm coming back to that term, which means if you're arguing that marijuana should be legalized, are you arguing for, medical marijuana should be legalized or recreational marijuana should be legalized? Are you using those terms? Two, the terms that pop up in the research and the literature, or are you making up your own terms like, pot for fun instead of recreational marijuana? You want to use the vocabulary of the issue because it shows you're aware of the way people talk about the issue and you're aware of the nuance of the issue, because all of these issues are argued because they're more complicated than people think and more complex than they imagine. So you want to think about your audience and how much you're assuming they know. And you're going to tell me that on a separate page. We'll talk about that later. So I'm going to know whether or not you think your audience knows a lot or a little about your topic. I know that's kind of meta in a lot of ways, but hopefully you get my gist. So spell out abbreviations. If you have longer words, it's okay to abbreviate them, but you want to, spell them out the first time and put the abbreviation right after it, and then thereafter you can just use the abbreviation. And I gave you a couple of examples there with the NAACP and NPR. So you might want to pause the video right now and write down a couple terms of your topic while they're fresh in your mind if some of them have popped up for you. So the tone of your audience is also reflected in your diction, or when I say diction, I mean your word choice, right? Because you are not speaking to an audience, you are speaking on paper, which means they don't have your body language, they don't have your pauses, your inflections, your, you know, loudness, nothing to tell what you're saying by except for your words and your punctuation. So you're trying to imbue your paper with a tone that you are educated, your audience is educated, they are formal and reasonable. So they are open to your argument. Even if they're against you, you're assuming they're open to listening to you, that they're not going to throw your paper in the garbage after paragraph one. Although you do want to make sure to try to still hook them and reel them in. Beyond that, it's up to you. You can take a serious tone, an urgent tone, a thoughtful tone, and you can be angry if you think that's going to be effective with your audience. Most people are turned off by anger, but in the current presidential campaign that some people are running right now, I'm making this video in the spring of 2016, and we're seeing Donald Trump. His anger is really resonating with people. So sometimes anger can be a powerful tone to use, but it also is probably going to have an extreme effect. So it may attract certain audiences, but it also might turn certain audiences off very much. So that's one thing to think about when you're thinking about your audience. There are different ways to affect a formal tone. Some of the easiest and main ways in academic writing are to avoid contractions. So don't spell out don't, write do not. If don't write television or don't write TV, write television. So try to avoid those shorthand abbreviations that we're so used to in our texting culture. You want to favor the objective third person, which is, writing people and Americans instead of you or we. If you're talking about people buying things, you might call them consumers. If you're talking about policies, you might call people voters. But you definitely want to stay away from second person you. And you only want to use first person, I and we, if you're really trying to connect with your audience in terms of you've got an experience or an observation from your own personal life that is relevant to your argument. And so in that section of the paper, you might use I there. But you do want to stay away from phrases like I believe, I think, in my opinion, personally, because they create what we sometimes call in academia a Dear Diary tone, which sounds strange, but that's kind of the tone we use with our diary. Like, I think that this, and I believe this. You're writing to yourself. It's not very persuasive, it's not very moving to people. It's just your thoughts, and you're sharing them with people. And that's all well and good. And perhaps in high school, that was something that teachers encouraged because we want students to be engaged and we encourage them to be expressive of their ideas because they're not yet ready for that college level academic, authoritative, objective language. That is what we want you to achieve, which is stepping back a little bit from you being the center of the universe and trying to focus more on your audience, more on them and less on you. Some other things you want to avoid are, insulting your audience by being like, of course, everybody knows that animal testing is wrong. Well, if everybody knows it, or it's obvious, then why are you writing about it? Then you're the dumb one, because why bother? People don't know this, and if you're assuming your audience believes something differently, then, try not to oversimplify the issue or minimize objections they might have by make pumping your position up with these kind of little phrases, filler phrases that might be insulting. So you also want to use qualified language. This is just a good idea. Usually more thoughtful people use it. And again, I keep coming back to our current political climate because I think that people right now are kind of angry at qualified language. They want this generalized, I'm drawing a line in the sand and this is my stance and I'm not budging and I'm not going to be politically correct. That kind of feeling is in the air right now, it seems. But in academia, again, which may be different from the larger or popular culture ethos, we avoid um, oversimplified language. We usually avoid, you can have a firm stance without overgeneralizing, without trying to make things seem either or. So you want to avoid words like all or everyone or Americans, because Americans are a big group of people, always. Even, again, coming back to Trump, because he's in the news right now, he may be, gone by the time this video is circulating a year from now, and you may say, why does she keep referencing him? But right now, a lot of what he's saying is, on the airwaves, and so he's getting chastised for saying things like Muslims are bad or Mexicans are druggies and or drug dealers, that kind of thing, because he's generalizing whole groups of people. So instead, you want to take a more thoughtful turn that and use words that show that that these are large groups of people that you're usually trying to make generalizations about. And we do have to make some generalizations, otherwise, we would never get out of particulars. We would never get out of this one story, that one story, and we have to create policies that apply to large groups of people. But we can be qualified and thoughtful about it. Try to avoid general language for specific language. And again, I just said we have to generalize at some point, right? So our thesis statement might be a bit general. Our topic sentences might be general. But the details, those supporting details that you get into in your body paragraphs, you want to try to make them more specific instead of general. And I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. So this is the paragraph, and I'm going to read it, and then I'd like for you to think about. Actually, I'm just going to pause, or you can pause here so you can read it, because why do you need me to read it? And then we'll talk about are there places where there are a lot of general statements where we could be more specific about our details? So go ahead and pause and read this paragraph. Okay, hopefully you did pause and read that paragraph. Here is that paragraph again on the left, and what I tried to do is color code and say these colored sentences could be more specific. They're pretty general. Oftentimes students will come to me, because they hit these roadblocks and they say, okay, I have to write this 5-page paper, Miss Reeds, but I'm on the bottom of page 2, maybe top of page 3, and I've said all I can say. I've covered all my reasons, all my support, and I don't know what else to say about the topic. And generally, they have covered a lot of things, but they have not covered them in depth. They've covered them superficially. They've given me all these general ideas with no specific breakdowns of them. And so I'll get a paragraph like this on the left, and I'll talk about how you could really break this paragraph up into maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs. So here you've got something that takes up 1/3 of a page that could be a page and a half. And I'll go through it here and try to explain to you what I mean by being more specific. So if you're going to say there are many reasons why obesity exists, and then you're going to give me those reasons. One of them is people eat more unhealthy food these days than they have before. So what you can do is tell me what kind of specific foods do we have today that we didn't have, 20, 30, 50 years ago, that kind of thing. That we could pull in, and I just gave a couple of examples there, fried and sugary fast food like hamburgers and french fries and sodas. But what we could even do is develop that by talking about in the past, how there were more stay-at-home moms who stayed at home and cooked more healthy meals, that we didn't have as much access to preservative-rich foods or to fried and sugary foods, that these days everything tastes a lot better probably than it did when it was plainer in the 1940s and 50s. It was, a pot roast with some salt and pepper and some potatoes and carrots, but we've paid a price for that too, is that when things taste better, we may eat more of them. We may not realize as we're making these things tasty. We're also increasing our salt and sugar content and our cholesterol, probably. So we could go into that a lot. People eat larger portions. Let's see if this link works on here. Oh, can I not make this happen while I'm. Oh, sorry. Trying to back up. I really want to show you this link because I think it's cool. How do I do this? Let me see if I can do this without stopping the video. If I go like that, continue recording. Hope you guys can see this because this is an experiment for me. Control C. Let's see if I can get in here. Alright, so hopefully you can see that on your screen. Zoom in a little bit. But this is talking about how sizes of fast food have changed since the 1950s. And so, back then you might have a 4-ounce burger, a 7-ounce drink, and 2.5-ounce fries. And now, we have these supersize everything that go with our meals. Let's see, how do I get back in here? All right. So we could also talk about how restaurants serve less healthy food than people normally fix themselves at home, and more people are eating out. We could talk about the health issues. So, oh, I closed it too soon here, didn't I? Is if we're talking about health issues, oh no, continue recording. Let's see. So we're talking about how it's cheaper, to buy fast food and food that's bad for you versus, healthier food. But here, this actually image shows that you could do it. So if you're making an argument that, a lot of people buy junk food like this because it's cheaper, that you actually can get some value for your money, if you eat healthy. And then having specific ideas about what kind of health issues, so type 2 diabetes and heart disease, and the study reports that an obese person, oh, so this one goes with the yellow. The health issues make it more likely people will need to see a doctor, and so America has increasing healthcare costs. And again, students will tell me that, but they won't go into the evidence from their research, and that's what you need to pull in the form of summary, paraphrase, and direct quotation. So here we have a direct quotation that says, the study reports that an obese person incurs medical costs that are $2,741 higher than if they were not obese. Nationwide, that translates into $190.2 billion per year, or 20.6% of national health expenditures. Previous estimates had pegged the cost of obesity at $85.7 million, or 9.1% of national health expenditures. And what I like about this quotation too is that it kind of gives you a range of costs. Like, here is what it costs per person, but here's what it costs nationally. And it even gives you the 9.1% of national health costs. So a lot of times when you get into these numbers, it can be hard to know what they mean. A lot of numbers sound big and impressive, but what do they mean on the grand scale? So making sense of numbers for your audience might be part of your job as well. So if you want to pause this now, it can be a fun activity and just enlightening to try to make general statements with specific details. So in class, what we do is, I have students pick one of these and try to develop them with specific details and still focus on that one idea. So if we're talking about shoes, we might talk about how different kinds of shoes, help you express yourself. Like, you can have flip-flops, being a Florida girl, I have many flip-flops. And so, but I have fancy flip-flops, and I have, sporty flip-flops, and I have like dressy flip-flops, those kind of things. So I could go into describing them and developing that paragraph and that idea. I'm not sure anyone else, unless they have a shoe fetish, would be interested in my paragraph, but I could do it. So maybe pause right now and try to write your own paragraph and see how hard or easy it comes to you to get those specific details in there while staying focused on this central point. This slide deals with an issue, but it is not an issue for everyone. There are some students have this issue a lot, and some students have it a little, and some students have it not at all. And that is the issue of saying the same thing in multiple different ways. And so we get that here, you know, or saying it in a way that is wordy. If you've ever had a teacher say, you're being a little bit wordy, this slide might apply to you in the next few. So you see that the example there says, for the summer social, she bought a dress that was yellow in color. Um, Obviously, yellow is a color, so we don't need was yellow in color. We could even make it more concise by saying, for the summer social, she bought a yellow dress. We don't need a dress that was yellow. That's a lot more words than we need. And so while that's not wrong, a lot of times your sentences, you want them to be concise. I mean, think about Twitter, think about our texting language, that people don't want to follow these long, winding sentences unless there's a point to them and they're particularly eloquent. But that's not eloquent, and there's no point in putting in that many words. It just makes you sound wordy and verbose. I'm not sure what the end result of the meetings will be. So here we have the idea that, the result is the end. So why do we need both words? One of the things that you can do is try to look at whether or not your sentences are wordy or redundant. And I'm not going to go through all these examples. You can pause them and look at them individually. I'll just go through a couple. But these are examples of how to make your writing more concise. So the first one says, when you need to make repairs to your appliance, carefully consult the owner's manual. And a more concise version of this sentence might be, when you need to repair your appliance, carefully consult the owner's manual. So you don't need to make repairs. It's a small change, but it does help your sentence be more concise. And again, later on, you see like adequate number of, where you could just replace it with enough. I know sometimes students fall into this trap, and I do it too, where I want to sound smart and I want to sound formal. And so adequate number of sounds smarter and more formal to me than enough. But the pitfall there is, if you have a lot of sentences like that, it's like chewing on, I don't know, what is it like chewing on? Chewing on something, marbles or something really cumbersome, where you're just trying to get the words out of your mouth and you've got too much going on. So, you know, if you find this is an issue for you, then try to be more concise. Or if you think it is, try to get somebody else to read your writing and see if they can give you some feedback on whether or not you sound too wordy. So I'll let you pause here. I'd like you to look at this paragraph and mentally just go through the screen and think, what could we omit, or how could we make this paragraph more concise? So I'll let you go ahead and pause it here. And then here is, hopefully you paused it and thought about it. Here is the more concise version. So it is a true fact that every year human beings, people, oh, I don't know what's going on there. I need to fix that. Human beings, people, start preparing for Christmas at an earlier time of year. Well, a fact should be true, so we don't need true fact. We don't need human beings and people. I think I meant to cross out human beings and replace it with people. Because human beings is two words and people is one, and human beings also sounds like you're kind of a robot. Start preparing for Christmas at an earlier time of year. Can we just say earlier? Why do we have to have all those words? When shopping in mid-November before Thanksgiving. Okay, well, mid-November is before Thanksgiving, so pick one or the other there. Everywhere I looked, I saw Christmas decorations. They were up on lampposts and on displays prominently presented throughout the store. Well, if it's on a display, it's probably being prominently presented. And again, prominent, you could say it's prominently presented, I guess, but display is much more concise. It was therefore a pleasant, unexpected surprise to find Nordstrom's had made a definite decision that Christmas should wait its turn, and so had not yet put up holiday decorations and adornments. Well, a surprise is unexpected. That's the definition of surprise. So you don't need both those words there. And a decision should be definite. That's the whole idea of a decision is you come to a point where you're like, this is the decision. Um, and finally, decorations, adornments are kind of a type of decoration. So we don't really need both of those there. If this is what things are like in the middle of November, I am scared what I will find when I venture out on 12 midnight Black Friday. Again, 12 midnight is repetitive. You can say midnight, you can say 12, either way, just pick one. I think even if you just said Black Friday, because most people are leaving now Black Friday, late in the night. So unless you really need the specific time there, just leave Black Friday. The end result, we already talked about end results. So the result of all this Christmas cheer before December is that I get angry. Because angry is a feeling, so we don't need to get to feeling angry. It's like my some relatives in the South, and they say, I'm fixing to do this or I'm fixing to do that. I said, why aren't you just doing it? Why are you always fixing? So we don't get to feeling angry, we're just angry. Okay, so another thing to be aware of that has to do with your word choice and your tone is how your organization of your words and your sentences affects your tone. So this is word choice, but it elevates it a little bit more, looks at sentence structure. Students often pepper their persuasive essays. Oh, that's kind of alliterative. Pepper your persuasive essay. Persuasive paper. Pepper your persuasive paper. They often pepper their persuasive papers with questions. They like to question the reader. And I have some guesses as to why this is, but they're just guesses. Some students have said I'm right, so I'm guessing it applies across the board. But one of the reasons you want to question the reader is because it creates an informal relationship. If you're asking the reader what they think of something, or you're even posing rhetorical questions, it's a very me and you type of tone. We're in this together, we're just talking here. And academic persuasive essays are often more elevated in formality than that, so you want to avoid questions. Also, students, they've said, I want to make the reader think about what I'm saying. And I think that's all well and good. I understand, wanting to really pose it philosophically to them and have them come to it in their own mind. But a lot of times people don't come to the place you think they're going to come to when you pose a question. And if you're trying to persuade them, you, especially in an academic essay, again, I'm going to say this may be different for other types of persuasion, but you want to tell the reader what to think. You want to spell out what to think. It's a more direct type of writing than maybe creative writing or even advertising kind of persuasion. Academics don't leave a lot of gray area. And so we're assimilating you into this academic persuasive writing, this academic argument. So that's one thing to think about when you're writing. And I tried to give an example. These are very short examples because I'm trying to fit it all on the slide and get through this. But an example might be if somebody's writing about obesity and they start off and they're saying, I say one of your jobs is to demonstrate that this topic that you're writing about is a problem and that it exists, right? And so they might say, haven't you seen a lot of large people around town? Don't you think obesity is a problem? But instead, what they should say is one can simply look around to see that many people in our lives are obese. And again, then they would tell me why it's a problem, not just ask me, don't you think it's a problem? What if your audience is like, no, I don't think it's a problem. I don't care about the issue. Well then, you failed as a persuader because your job is to make them care. Your job is to enlist them and try to get them to think the way you want them to think. And then number two, also avoid using questions to transition. So this is what I always think of like the softball approach is that students kind of lob a ball up so that they can hit it. Um, and so they might say, obesity is a severe problem in the United States. Looking around, you might ask yourself, why is this such a big issue? Obesity is an issue because. So, don't use questions to transition. Use pronouns, use synonyms, use natural segues to go from one idea to the next. And again, if you find yourself having trouble with this, reach out to me and I'll see if we can work on it together. I think, again, in our texting culture and our internet culture, we tend to use, ellipses, dot, dot, dot for transitions a lot now. So our brains aren't really, haven't had a lot of practice all the time at making formal transitions in writing. So denotation and connotation is the next thing I want to talk about. And denotation and connotation are different ways of looking at word meaning. And you want to be aware of course, the denotation of words, which is their literal meaning. But you also want to be aware of the connotations of the words you use, of how they affect your reader and all the associations that they carry with them. And this is hard because if you're not a reader yourself, or even if you are a reader, if you're just not someone who pays attention to words, I've always been someone who's interested in the way people use words, what words they use, how they use them. It's just the way I'm wired, but I understand that a lot of people are not. And so if you haven't been attentive to that for most of your life, um, it can sometimes be hard to know what the connotations of a word are because it's not something someone can hand you like a math equation and be like, here's the quadratic formula for connotations. Now you understand. It comes with a lot of experience. So, connotations are all the associations that words inspire in their audience. And this is an older example, but a long time ago, many moons ago, the Obama administration was trying to figure out how to give money to these big companies like AIG and Valak, and there were some auto companies as well, like I think General Motors. But there were a lot of big banks in there as well. Anyway, they were trying to figure out how to help these companies out because they thought if these companies declare bankruptcy and fail, so many people are going to be unemployed, it's going to be ridiculous. And then our economy is going to tank. So they took the taxpayer money and they bundled it into a loan to give to these big banks and these auto companies. And they were seeking approval from Congress for this. And they were trying to figure out what to call it. So at first they called it the economic bailout package, right? Because they were bailing out these big companies. They had gotten themselves into these horrible predicaments, and that we could spend all day talking about why. We're not going to go there. But when they when they called it that, a lot of people did not want to support it because they said a bailout has negative connotations. It's like this idea of like when you bail out a boat, the water's coming in and it's sinking and you're trying to get it out. But it's also the idea of like bailing somebody out of jail. Like they've done something horribly wrong. Why should I go in and give them money? Like I'm not going to bail them out of this mess they got themselves into. So then they were like, okay, what if we called it the rescue package? Because that has a more positive connotation, right? Rescue. Everybody wants to be the hero. But people still weren't that thrilled with it because they still kind of felt like, why am I rescuing these big companies? Like, yeah, that's a nice thing to do, but their, CEOs make millions of dollars and I make 40,000 a year and I'm not so thrilled with that idea. And so finally they settled on the Consumer Protection Act, which sounds much more positive, right? It doesn't even sound anything about these big banks that they were bailing out, these big companies. It sounds like we're protecting you, the consumer, because, if these companies fail, then it's going to have negative effects on you, the consumer. And I think I don't know if that helped it at all. I think people were so disenchanted by that point. They were probably like, yeah, whatever. Okay, go bail them out. But it was very controversial, and they were trying to find words to help sell their position. And that's partially what you find with persuasion as well, is that words do matter. A lot of controversy has surrounded illegal immigration and what to call people who are in the country and have come here through illegal means or have broken laws to come here. Maybe that's the better way to put it. And so you will find people who are usually pro deportation, so people who want to deport all the people who are here and are not documented to be here. They will call them illegal aliens. The other side, who often says, you know what, a lot of people who are here, yeah, they've, broken laws to be here, but they have contributed to our economy, they have families here, they love America. If they go back now, they will have nothing in their home country, like you can't just send them back. And so they will call them undocumented workers. And so you will often see in the literature, if you're researching this issue, that if someone has a specific stance, their word choice will reflect that. And also sometimes if you're approaching somebody from an opposite point of view, your word choice can be a bridge to them. And you may not want to use extremist language because it might alienate them. Yeah, I'm not going to get deep into that because that could turn into a real rabbit hole. But hopefully, you can think about your topic now and whether there are such cases of extremist language in yours. Sometimes gun control might have that kind of language. A lot of hot button issues have word choices that inflame people. Civilian casualties versus collateral damage. So when people are involved, when people die sometimes in war, and they are not soldiers, civilian casualties does not sound as good as collateral damage. Collateral damage sounds like it's happening to a thing. It doesn't even sound like a person died. But both of them really are euphemisms for the idea that, innocent people were killed by somebody's military. And so these connotations that amass over time, these feelings and associations people have about words, you want to be careful of how you use them in your paper. Government assistance versus entitlement programs. So if we're talking about something like welfare, SNAP, food stamps, even Social Security sometimes is referred to as, a government program. And some people will call them, welfare is probably the most negative word choice. But entitlement programs is right up there also with having negative connotations, because when you think about somebody who feels entitled, it means that they're saying these people don't deserve what they're getting, but they think they should get it anyway. And so there are many people who are against government assistance of giving people, unemployment or food stamps, things like that. They think that welfare creates this entitlement culture where people think, well, I deserve, all these things, even though I'm not working. And on the other side, people who believe in these programs and their capacity to help will say they call it government assistance. Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act. It was originally called the Affordable Care Act, and those people who disliked it started calling it Obamacare, but then the people who liked it started even calling it Obamacare, so they kind of took the oomph out of the name after a while. Pro-choice versus pro-abortion. So a lot of people will say pro-choice versus pro-life. So the pro-life camp had their name first, and then the pro-choice side obviously didn't want to call themselves pro-death or pro-abortion because it has a negative connotation. But sometimes the pro-life people will call the pro-choice people pro-abortion. So you can see how that has a negative connotation. And I'm not going to go ahead and click on this link because it just goes into a whole nother article, but it really is interesting. It's part of the People First initiative, which a lot of companies have adopted. When you're talking about people, you don't talk about them with the adjective first, so you don't refer to people with mental illness as mentally ill, because that makes the whole person mentally ill. They're defined by that illness. Whereas people first language, you have people with mental illness or people with cancer or people um, who are unemployed, not the unemployed. It helps to using that kind of language helps you to see this as a personal issue and helps make it less likely that people will treat people like objects or like policies, things like that. So people first language has a more positive connotation of being more thoughtful and more considerate of the actual people involved in these topics you're writing about. So you can pause here and kind of explore some of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are some examples of how words can have different connotations but kind of mean the same thing. So the one that I'll um, pick on here is giggle versus cackle. Both of them mean laugh, but giggle has more connotations of being feminine, of being like a little girl, or a child giggles, whereas cackles more negative, like a witch cackles or somebody evil. But it is interesting how even words can take on a feminine connotation. So there's nowhere that says that giggle is feminine. But if I said to you, President Obama giggled, you might think, oh, well, that seems pretty effeminate. Um, so words take on these feelings and associations through use. So we've used giggle so much to describe little girl or women and children that it's just that meaning is embedded in it now. And words can change over time. So sometimes words will come into a culture having no connotation or having a positive connotation, but through use they become positive or negative. And the example that I usually think of is retarded, is that to call someone retarded once upon a time was not a slur or negative or pejorative, it was a descriptor um, about mental capacity. But because people took that word and started calling non mentally retarded people retarded, and they used it as an epithet, as a curse to call people, then it came with all these negative connotations. So then people with disabilities did not want to have that word anymore because the general culture had corrupted it. And words have meaning and they have the power to hurt or influence. Again, I'm not going to click on this link. This is one more example for a while back as Edward Snowden was in the news and what people called him mattered, right? If you thought he was a whistleblower, a leak, a traitor, or a hero, that reflected your viewpoint on what he did. Whether you thought he was blowing the whistle on a government that was being unethical and sneaky, or whether you thought he was a traitor, somebody who went against the government, who was committing treason, or a hero, somebody who shed light on, big brother government spying on us. So a lot of these word choices you use reflect a whole host of other beliefs that come with them. One of the things you can do is if you want to pause here is take a minute and think of some synonyms for the underlined words and then reread the sentence. So it can be very enlightening to see how just changing a word to a word that means the same thing essentially can change the whole feeling of the sentence. So if I said to you, the Honda Civic she bought was inexpensive versus the Honda Civic she bought was cheap, cheap has a much more negative connotation to it. It has this idea of not being well made and inexpensive still, but not being well made. So this slide again is maybe something you want to come back to or just make note of. Well, a lot of these things I want you to take note of, but this will come out when you write your essay in particular in the outline that I'm going to give you guys. But they're words and phrases that might help you handle your topic. So if you're talking about groups that are in support of your topic, you might call them proponents, advocates, supporters, stakeholders, backers, sponsors. If you're talking about people who are against you, you might say critics, naysayers. I like that, naysayers. It sounds so 1800s or something. Protesters, dissenters. Try to avoid, students often say those who are pro blank or those who are con blank. I mean, pro and con do mean for and against, but they are unwieldy and they're kind of these shorthand words. There are also some templates there for helping you to introduce your reasons and evidence. So, I'm not going to read them all, but you might say, one supporting point of, you know, physician assisted suicide is that blah, blah, blah. And you give your supporting point, and then you develop that supporting point in a paragraph. So I don't want to turn this into like a mechanical 5 paragraph essay for you, but I also think it's helpful sometimes to have these starting prompts. Try to avoid saying, if you're quoting someone, so and so says, and instead try to use verbs that are varied and that are correct for what you're trying to argue. If you're trying to show that somebody's explaining something, instead of arguing it, use explains. But if they're arguing something, you might say Harvard economist John Smith argues blank. All right, the last section of our PowerPoint deals with figurative language, and this is what the assignment after this is going to be about. And so figurative language basically deals with, it's the opposite of literal language. So it's when the writer uses language that is metaphorically or not exactly, or as my son sometimes tells me, it's language that lies. So, oh, this is kind of funny. I guess I should look at this. Hopefully you're still with me. Okay, so here it says literally means actually or without exaggeration. When you say I literally, it means you're describing something exactly as it happened. You are being literal. So if you were to say excellent joke, I literally peed myself laughing, this is what you're implying. A large urine stain is formed on your pants. Or if you say I literally got your back, bro, this is what you're implying. I possess your spine, bro. And he has an example from Jerry Falwell, who, before he died in 2007, said, if we do not act now, homosexuals will own America. If you and I do not speak up now, this homosexual steamroller will literally crush all decent men, women, and children who get in its way, and our nation will pay a terrible price. So, I thought that was, no matter your political stance, I thought that was kind of funny. And that it did illustrate the concept of literally versus figuratively quite well. And I'm going to zoom through some of this, and because I think this video is getting a little long, but I will explain here. We just talked about literally versus figuratively. Some kinds of figurative language that we're going to talk about are analogies, metaphors, similes, and personification. So for the assignment after this, I am going to want you to be able to identify the differences between those 4 kinds of figurative language. So analogies are extended comparisons where it's not just one thing to one thing. It's usually like this overall big thing and then all the parts in it, 2 or more things compared to 2 or more things. So an example might be this quote from a Northwestern student who says, I look at this as being in the form of a house, and the students are the foundation, and the teachers are the walls, and the roof itself is the school. And we know that if you have a weak foundation, the walls and the roof can't be supportive. Therefore, it crumbles. So again, we see this extended comparison. The teachers are the walls, the roof itself is the school, the students are the foundation. So you've got 3 things being compared there. So the metaphors are a way, that analogy you just saw is a kind of metaphor, they're a way of seeing something in terms of something else. And they usually help us to understand things. So here's an example. The teacher descended upon the exams, sank his talons into their pages, ripped the answers to shreds, and then, perching in his chair, began to digest. So, what do you think the teacher here is being compared to? Hopefully, you said a bird of prey, because that's what it seems like, or, a hawk or something. The school is a jungle and the students the wild animals within. So what two things are being compared here? The school to a jungle and the students to animals. The young women were cool and confident lionesses, checking out their prey at the club. So the young women are being compared to lions on the prowl. So similes are a lot like metaphors, except they are a little bit more explicit about their comparison. They use like or as to show their comparison. So her face was pale as the moon. It's comparing how white her face is to the moon. My feet felt like concrete blocks after a hard day of waitressing. So there's the word like in here, comparing feet to concrete blocks. And other kinds of figurative language exist, such as personification, which is when human qualities are, or animalistic qualities are given to non-living things. The thunder growled to be let in. Thunder obviously doesn't growl, an animal growls. The house's windows were glowing eyes in the stormy night, so the windows are being compared to eyes there. The book begged to be read. Well, a book can't actually beg, it's a thing, and so you've got figurative language there. All these items are being personified. So why bother to use metaphors in your persuasive essay? They enliven ordinary language. They help us to get out of our rut, right? They're also generous to our audience because they encourage them to kind of think more about what they're saying, as long as we're not using cliches. And also, sometimes I think they help us to express ourselves when there is no easy word to fit what we're saying. So if you've ever really been in love or even in hate with somebody or something, you often find that words fail you. To say I love you, you feel like, oh my gosh, love has been said so many times, and you say I love you about your phone, or you say I love you to your dog, and I know it's not the right word for this person. I am madly, madly, passionately in love with this person. I need a new word. So sometimes metaphors can help you express yourself there because the words that are out there just don't do enough. And also they make you look smart, so that's a good reason to use them. So, we're not going to go through this slide. Just go ahead and skip past it. Try to avoid cliches when you are trying to come up with metaphors, because cliches do the opposite of what good metaphors do, which is they shut down thinking. They were once clever or original, but now they're just boring. So the idea of life as a journey, not a destination, while that may be true, is pretty boring and overdone. Some other cliches, and I'm just going to point out the ones I hear from students, is I usually hear them in the conclusion or think outside the box, and I know we hear that from teachers too, so I'm not just trying to say just students do that, but a lot of times when they'll get to the solution part of their essay, students will say, we need to think outside the box and do X. Or at the end of the essay, they'll say, all things said and done, or in conclusion. These are things that are pretty cliche when it comes to ways to end your essay. And there's an example of a cliche in use and how you might fix it so it's not a cliche anymore. And I encourage you to pause here and read it. So for some people, metaphors come easily. For some, they do not. But I do encourage you to try your hand at it. You don't want them all over your paper. That could be a bit overwhelming. But if you find that there is a place where an analogy or personification or a simile or metaphor is appropriate, I do encourage you to try to use it. So sometimes what I try to do is I try to think about the thing that I'm trying to create the figurative language about and to try to think of its characteristics. What does it make me think of? And I was thinking, okay, what about redemption? And redemption, does things like it makes you feel new, it makes you feel clean, it makes you feel like you don't have any kind of record anymore. So I was saying a rough attempt is redemption is having your sins struck from the record as if they never existed. Or finally, redemption is like a freshly mowed field right after it rains. So it gives you that idea. It may not be great, but it's an attempt. So when you're thinking about your persuasive essay, I say and your speech, but don't worry about that. You want to try to compare something in your topic to something else. So, if you're talking about gun control, sometimes someone compared guns. I'm trying to remember now in her essay. She was writing about guns and she said, people, what did she say? People blaming guns for murder is like me blaming my pencil for misspellings. Now, I don't know if I agree with her about the logic of that. We got into a little tussle about it, a good tussle. But I do admire the attempt there, and I kind of thought, oh, okay, I can see, where she's going with that. Illegal immigration. Sometimes people who are against illegal immigration or illegal immigrants will compare it to a flood. They'll say the flood of illegal immigrants. So they're talking about people, we're drowning in illegal immigrants. They're comparing it to some kind of, tsunami that's out to get you. These are a few examples of a student's essay where she integrated figurative language, and I'm just going to read a couple. And she did it pretty well, I thought. Here, this was on the housing crisis. It says the current housing crisis, coupled with our present bad economy, has hit our country with a steel fist and has affected everyone and everything. So obviously, an economy or a housing crisis does not have a steel fist. There's some personification going on there. Or again, personification on the second column at the top. It says, until the economy gets back on its feet, there will be no way of knowing which jobs will be safe and which ones will not. Try to highlight there. And this slide just gives an example of in the news you'll find figurative language all the time. So it says Obama introduced a recovery plan equal to the task that would be the largest public works spending program since the interstate highway system was built a half century ago. We've got to provide a blood infusion to the patient right now to make sure the patient is stabilized, and that means that we can't worry short term about the deficit. We've got to make sure that the economic stimulus plan is large enough to get the economy moving. So there's no literal patient who needs a blood infusion. They're talking about the economy and how this recovery plan is like a blood infusion, and the United States economy is like a patient, and we've got to do that. This recovery plan will stabilize the economy. And I'm going to just zoom through that because that's just another example. And you will see these on the next assignment I have for you, so don't worry about them here. All right, so hopefully you feel very enlightened when it comes to the word choices you will make in your persuasive essay and how you can be persuasive through careful word choice.